If you know anything about origami or Pokemon, you might recognize this object. It's a Pikachu made using origami that my son Asher decided to create in bulk and sell to his classmates at the age of 8. In theory, it was a really imaginative idea. He started selling them at school, individual Pikachus, 3-packs. He even made holiday bundles with different designs. In practice, though, things got a little out of hand. First, other kids started making their own versions and selling them for less money. Suddenly, there was a price war, and kids were taking sides. Asher's teacher, Mr. Hamby, he implemented a price cap of 10 cents to try to help out, but when that didn't work, he banned classroom businesses altogether. Well, Asher thought it was highly unfair that his great idea and his business initiative had been shut down. And he made sure everyone knew just how unhappy he was. In fact, his reaction and his behavior was so big, he had to spend the rest of the day recovering in the principal's office. Shortly after the origami Pikachu incident, our family moved here to Amsterdam. One of Europe's hubs of innovation and creativity. And in living in the middle of this startup capital, I started seeing and hearing the word disruptor being used everywhere. And it was always used to describe companies and people in a really positive, incredible way. And I thought to myself, we are going to fit in really well here. Because if there's one thing Asher had been called many times in his short life, it was disruptor. But in his case, the word was always used in a negative way. I can't help but think that someday I might see Asher's picture on the cover of a magazine being celebrated as an industry disruptor. But back then, when his ideas and creations often resulted in chaos in the classroom, his only claim to fame would have been for disrupting the school day. So while others have called him a disruptor, I call him differently wired. Differently wired refers to anyone who is neurologically atypical. So for Asher, that means he's both highly gifted and he has ADHD. For others, it might mean those diagnoses, or it could be dyslexia, dysgraphia, autism, giftedness, anxiety, sensory processing disorder, or there may not even be a formal diagnosis, but the person's clearly moving through the world in a unique way. So before I go on, I just want to invite you to take a moment and apply this definition of differently wired to your colleagues, your friends, your family, your children, or maybe even yourself. Chances are every single one of us in this room, or watching this talk online, is picturing not just one differently wired person in their life, but more likely many. You see, if we take all those differences and we consider them together, suddenly our population of different people is enormous. At a minimum, based on current diagnoses, it's 1 in every 5 people. That's more than 1.5 billion differently wired people worldwide. So why are we still seeing differently wired people as outliers, as abnormal, and when they're kids, as disruptors, but the bad kind? I remember when I was younger, one of my teachers told a story about this truck that got stuck in the entrance of a tunnel because it was too high. And all these adults were running around frantically, calling engineers and firefighters and trying to figure out how to get this truck unstuck, until this little girl, this child who could look at the situation with fresh eyes, finally said, "Why don't you just let the air out of the tires?" This is the kind of thinking that differently wired people bring to the world. They see and feel things that other people don't. I want to talk with you about why we need to make big changes to the way differently wired people, and specifically kids, are perceived, treated, and supported in our homes, in our schools, and in our society. Because we are going to need their contributions. Parenting Asher back in those origami Pikachu days, I was desperate for information and just to connect with other parents. So I founded a podcast and a community for parents like me, hoping there'd be a few others out there who could use it. Well, the emails started pouring in with stories that I could have written myself. Stories of parents whose kids had been kicked out of their neighborhood preschool. Parents who are on lengthy waiting lists for assessments or tests that probably aren't even covered by insurance. Parents who feel as if they can't even speak out loud about their struggle because of the stigma their child might face for being different. I can tell you from personal experience, this process is heartbreaking. It's nerve-wracking, and it's incredibly lonely. I said before there are 1.5 million differently wired people in the world. How is it that with such a huge number, we still all feel like we're going at this alone? So that's what's happening at home, but what's happening in schools? Well, no surprise, but most aren't working well for anybody. The kids that we would call normal, the kids who comply and cooperatively do their work, they get less attention because the higher maintenance kids are taking up so much teacher time. And the differently wired kids, one little boy in my community told his mother when she picked him up from school one day, "Mom, school is killing my dreams." And that pretty much sums it up. So just like what happened when Asher lost his origami Pikachu business, these kids are often punished for their behavior that stems from their atypical wiring. They get bullied for their social differences. Over time, they start to identify as the bad kid, and they internalize the message they're receiving that they're broken or they're wrong. These kids also have a higher chance of being suspended or kicked out of school, which research shows us increases their chances of ending up in prison. We actually have a name for this in the US, the school-to-prison pipeline. That's right, there are kids going from school to crimes to jail in a cycle that we have the power to reverse. Luckily, there is good news here. Each year, we're starting to see more and more schools try to find ways to teach atypical kids so they can learn the way they learn and they can feel respected for who they inherently are. And now companies are starting to do the same. So think about your own work environment for a moment. I'm sure that many of you here are working for innovative and creative companies. So you might also be reading the same studies I am that point to diversity as the key to innovation. And while many of the articles point to gender or cultural diversity, many are skipping what I believe will be the biggest game changer here, neurodiversity. In fact, I would venture to say that companies will need differently wired people to be successful in the future. If you look at some of the most modern, innovative creators of today, Elon Musk, Richard Branson, Steve Jobs, these are disruptors. These are people whose unique wiring has allowed them to approach their problems and work life differently. They're nonconformists. They probably would have started their own origami Pokemon business if it had been around when they were kids. But even though these are the kind of employees that businesses need, many companies don't know how to hire and retain differently wired adults. Just think about what's involved in and what's expected in a typical interview process. Good eye contact, confident communication. Oftentimes, there are written assessments or tests that have to be finished under tight time constraints. Or just imagine how those open floor plans that so many companies embrace can create all kinds of problems for someone who's highly sensitive or highly distractible. Again, there's good news here. Some companies like Microsoft, Hewlett-Packard, Ernst & Young, they are starting to seek out neurodiverse employees. At one software testing company, founded by 2 MIT grads, Ultra Testing, 75% of the employees are on the autism spectrum. And the founders say that these employees give them a competitive edge. And to eliminate potential anxiety of an in-person interview, they do their interviews over Skype. And they have adapted their work culture so these employees can thrive. There's no question we're in a time of shifting paradigms. I mean, even 20 years ago, if Asher had been a student and wanted to start his origami business at school, probably wouldn't have even gotten off the ground. Today, the possibility was there. But we still have a lot further to go. And I can't stress this point enough, not just for the happiness of our kids, but in order to meet the needs of our collective future, we have to change the way we see and support differently wired people. We have to show more understanding and empathy for these kids and their families so they feel less alone. We have to recognize the way that we may be contributing to the stigma without even realizing it. And we have to stop treating these kids like the bad kind of disruptors when they're in school and start embracing them in our workplaces and our society when they're adults. Because we are going to need their unconventional way of being and all the gifts that come with it. So whether you're a community member, a friend, a neighbor, a colleague, a parent, an employer, a teacher, my question for you is this: how will you disrupt the status quo and play a role in this particular revolution? Thank you.